Welcome to another video, and today it is the 30th of November, and today I will be going over the situation in Bakhmut, and then tomorrow I'll go over the situation in Crimea. So, just to refresh anybody's memory about the situation in Bakhmut over the past week or two, the Wagner group, and they worked in tandem with some of the units from the DPR and LPR, they were able to get control of the rest of this urban-type settlement north of Horlivka called Zaitsev. And so they cleared up a lot of the Ukrainian positions that were centered around this suburb over here called Jovanka. And so a lot of the trenches over here were taken over. And in the process, the Russian forces were able to reach this highway over here and take over a lot of the bush lines. So capitalizing on this success, they were then able to go and cross the highway, take over parts of the rail line, and then actually take over Ozaryanivka, which was a key Ukrainian node of defense for many months, which was a very tough nut to crack, but only did once the town or train station in Mayorsk was captured. So then you had this two-pronged assault, one from the south and one from the east onto Ozaryanivka. So once that happened, the Russians, they were able to advance onto Kordyumivka and Zelenopilia, using the train line and just mopping up the remaining Ukrainian resistance. And then they also launched another attack from the east using their positions in Odradivka and Mykolaievka Druha. And so they crossed over, took over the town of Andriivka, and fought in these quarries for a few days against the Ukrainian forces. Most notably the 30th Brigade, that's one of the largest units that was involved in the fighting over here on the Ukrainian side. So you can see there was fighting in these quarries. And then 2-3 days ago, the Wagner group took over Zelenopilia, and then it was either yesterday or 2 days ago, the Russian troops took full control of Kordyumivka, including this area to the west of the train station at Kordyumivka. And they reached the this canal over here, which connects to Donetsk and Severodonetsk. So from there, we need to have an update now on what's been going on for the past day or two. So we have the Russian troops regrouping and now preparing for another assault, now in the direction of Klishchivka. So really, Klishchivka is the last town that is standing before the Russians are able to get Bakhmut into the semicircle. So what I mean by this is that Klishchivka is in between the Russian lines, which are in red, and the road from Bakhmut to Chasiv Yar, which is another really fortified city, a supply hub in the Donbass. And so in between those two towns, you have Ivanivske. And so taking over Ivanivske is vital, and it is certainly a part of Russia's plan right now. So Klishchivka is really the one thing standing in the way of that right now, which is why you do have a lot of Ukrainian troops situated in this area, and they are not withdrawing just yet. They are trying to put up a defense here, which is why we haven't seen the town fall yet. But you could expect to see an attack on Klishchivka from Opitny, first of all, because now the Russians are also advancing onto Opitny. And also, of course, from the south, where we have positions that were taken by Russia in Andriivka, which is this hamlet, but there's also a snail farm over there. And also, of course, from the Kordyumivka area, there really aren't that many Ukrainian fortifications in the way. Some of them are centered around the bushes, obviously, but a lot of that is really was haphazardly dug. And so it doesn't have the best architecture, doesn't have the best design, and so it could be taken over pretty easily. The Ukrainian troops are not able to put up a long and protracted defense in some of these bush lines, especially because of how far away it is from the main communication and transport hubs. And so it's very difficult to evacuate wounded people, to get new fuel and new ammunition when you're isolated in this like trench line around a bush, where if you step out of it, you could get hit by aviation or shelling or drones or anything like that, and which is why they are all now moving towards Klishchivka. Okay, so in Klishchivka, you have the 30th, not 30th, but the 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade, and you have the 112th Kiev Defense Brigade. So these are territorial defense units. You also have some other battalions from big units like the 93rd Brigade, 53rd Brigade, 54th Brigade, 58th Brigade. Those are some of the most notable units. You also have the 30th Brigade in here somewhere. This is probably the 30th. Oh, I have a duplicate. Anyway, let's go on to some of the other news from Bakhmut. So you have these Ukrainian sapper units. These are engineers, and they are now actually building fortifications north of Opitny. And so Opitny is over here. It is a southern suburb of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians are still in control of most of it, but the Russians were able to gain this nuke polygon over here that I drew. Using their positions in Enircled, they crossed over the Bakhmutovka River, took over the soccer field, and took over some of the residential buildings, although the music school is still under Ukrainian control. The music school is over here. This is where you had a lot of the Ukrainian positions over the past few weeks when there was this back and forth fighting in between Opitny and Enircled. So now it seems like the Russians have been able to break through in some areas, so you have units from the Ukrainian side building up defenses around over here, because they don't want the Russians to break through and form a spearhead from the south, which reaches the center of Bakhmut, and importantly, this dam over here. You can see this body of water. This is the Bakhmut Dam, and they don't want the Russians getting to this position. In order to sort of null the Russian artillery advantage, because even Zelensky admitted that the Russians have about a 9-to-1 artillery advantage in general in this war. The Ukrainians, they've now moved 10 of their M777 howitzers that have these Excalibur guided shells from the Zaporizhia front to Bakhmut. So these were probably going to be used in Zaporizhia for whatever offensive they had planned to push the Russians back even further away from places like Tokmak and Polohi. So now those have to be moved away, which implies that the Ukrainians are putting on hold their plans for an offensive operation around Zaporizhia until the situation in Bakhmut sort of stabilizes. And speaking of supplies, it's been very difficult for the Ukrainians to move in supplies in recent days, especially from roads such as the one from Chasiv Yar to Bakhmut, or from Toretsk to Bakhmut, Konstantinivka to Bakhmut, or even from places like Soledar to Bakhmut. A lot of these roads are coming under Russian fire, and I'm going over drawing them in red right now, these key roads that are leading to Bakhmut. A lot of these are within the range of Russian artillery, and because of Russia's artillery advantage, they're willing to expend a huge amount of artillery shells to make sure that the Ukrainians don't actually use these roads a lot. And so this is making the transfer of equipment, transfer of ammo, transfer of fuel, transfer of reinforcements especially very, very difficult. And this is part of the reason why Russia wants to get fire control over all of the supply routes. They don't have fire control over the ones that are coming in from the north, like the E40 one over here, but they do sort of have fire control over the one in Ivanivske, because we did see this CNN video segment from the western outskirts of Bakhmut, and it showed how it was subjected to very heavy Russian shelling, and that even houses in these parts of Bakhmut in the western edge, which is farther away from the fighting, it's about let's see, about 3.5, almost 4 miles away from the fighting. Even in those areas, the houses are completely devastated, and this will only get worse if Klishivka falls, which it probably will because of the aforementioned reasons. And then from there, of course, the Russians will be able to reach the road and cut off the remaining supplies from Konstantinivka. And really the only place where they'll be able to get supplies is from open fields, which has to be very done discreetly and in much smaller volume, or from the north. And so it will be a very untenable position for the Ukrainians to hold, especially as the Russians will start to put pressure on the northern suburbs around Pithorodny. And then from there, they might also turn to the west and attack some of the other Ukrainian positions in a place like Chasiv Yar, where they do have extensive fortifications in the forests around Chasiv Yar, but they might want to catch the Ukrainian garrison there off guard to make sure that the lines don't stabilize again. And so I could see that happening, where the Russians try to secure their flanks once they reach Ivanivske and attack maybe not Chasiv Yar, but maybe some of the surrounding areas, and maybe places like Stupochki, or maybe they turn their way south and cross the canal and work with the Wagner groupings in Kordiumivka to attack a place like Bielahora. That is also something that's on the table at the moment. So this would just be done to first secure the flanks, but then looking into the bigger picture, they would want to go after Bakhmut and attack a place like Toretsk, because Toretsk is a very large city. It's one of the parts of the front line where there's barely been any changes since the beginning of the war, and dislodging this huge Ukrainian grouping from this city would be very good for the tactical situation in places like New York, and then to a further extent in Avdiivka. And so this could sort of be a domino effect, sort of like the one in Popasna, but on a larger scale. And so the Ukrainians are trying to offset this threat by sending in a lot of the reinforcements from Kherson. As I said, this transport is not just complicated by the cutting off of the supplies via roads because of shelling, but also because of the mud, which is really making it difficult for the transport of trucks, of tanks, of infantry fighting vehicles, of BMPs, stuff like that. And so they have to use the rail lines. But the problem is that Russia, in recent days, they've struck some key rail hubs in central Ukraine, so in places like Kryvyi Rih and Zaporizhia, in Dnipro, and in other rail hubs. And this is making it very difficult for the supplies to be moved in. Not only that, but the power supply system obviously is being targeted in Ukraine, as it has been for the past almost 2 months now. That's making it very difficult for the Ukrainians to use their electric trains, so they gotta rely on the diesel trains. And sure, they can use those, but first of all, there are less Ukrainian diesel trains than electric trains, and second of all, those would just like transport equipment and troops at a lesser volume, and those could also be targeted, of course. A lot of those supplies are coming in from the town of Pokrovsk, which is over here. I'll circle it for everyone. And then from there, it either goes to Druskivka, where it would just go like further north from there into the Seversk front, or towards Konstantinivka, and then from there it would go to the Bakhmut front. And so we have been seeing Russia sort of try to shape the battlefield in recent days in order to get ready for the winter season. I don't think that they're going to go through with all of these plans now, because they're still like getting ready with their rounds of mobilization, and they would want to first coalesce their gains and get all of their new mobilized troops integrated and ramp up production before they actually go ahead and launch these larger scale operations. So for now, they're really just trying to gain a favorable position while the Ukrainians have a disadvantage right before the winter starts. And so we're seeing this happen in other areas as well, like in Bielahorivka. The Russians are now in control over here in the southern Bielahorivka. They're also apparently in control of Spirny based on geolocated videos. So it's said that the 4th Motorized Brigade of the LPR has now taken over Spirny. Now, I know that the Wagner group, they posted, specifically Prigozhin, he said that Spirny is not under the Russian control, so maybe it's not actually. I'm not exactly sure if it is. I just am relying on the video. But it's possible that there is a back and forth going on and that some reconnaissance units entered and they promptly left. But either way, it seems like the Russians have been able to stabilize the front over here and actually make some marginal gains around these towns that they had previously held. The significance of this is that using like Spirny, they can attack Vimka, where there is a train station, and you can see there's a line there, a supply route to Seversk and to the rest of the front line. They could also attack Vesele, where you do have some commands, forces, some of the command structure of the front line is centered around Vesele, and really from there isn't much in the way of the Russians and the main line supplying northern Bakhmut, places like Krasnohora and the northern parts of Soledar and Seversk, which is why it is important for Ukraine to hold the front line closer to the Bakhmut highway than the northern Bakhmut-Seversk highway. But again, these are plans for later months, and it won't happen for a pretty long time. In the meantime, I would expect the Russians just to continue ramping up their artillery strikes and to continue to advance in certain areas, taking over some of the suburbs. I don't expect to see any frontal assaults on Bakhmut. They tried doing that by advancing on Patris-Lumamba streets, and we saw how that went. The Ukrainians were able to hold their ground in the industrial areas. And really the best that Russia could do is take over the garbage dump. So who knows? Maybe they'll be able to push the Ukrainians out of at least the Bakhmutivka district, and then they'll have this sort of block under their control. But this is not enough to cause the entire city to crack. The only way to do that is, as I said, to get a flanking on. And we actually could see the elevation over here, just to get a perspective of how this all looks. So here you can see the topographic map. You can see the elevation. You can see this is the highway that I've been talking about between Mayorsk and Bakhmut. And you can see that this highway is on a very low elevation, but the areas surrounding it are on a higher elevation. So this is the highway. And then you can see that places like Kordyumivka, they are much higher in elevation, which is why the Ukrainians wanted to hold onto it so badly, and why it is a problem that they have lost it. Because now the Russians can set up their artillery here on the high ground and actually be level with the Ukrainian artillery in Chasiv Yar, which is being moved in right now. So you can see artillery duels going on between these two settlements. And a lot of the Russian artillery will obviously be hitting this road over here, which is partially in lower elevation. Bakhmut itself is in a very low elevation area, and you do have Russians in control of this part over here, these positions in Kordyumivka and Mayorsk, which are being used to shell Bakhmut itself, and also these areas to the east of Bakhmut, where there is a bit of a higher elevation area, pretty hilly over there. You could see shelling into the valleys in Bakhmut, and that's a part of the reason why it is so difficult to hold on to Bakhmut. As a result, a lot of the Ukrainian troops, they're staying in a lot of basements in the apartment buildings in Bakhmut just to avoid the shelling, and from there they're actually operating their drones. These are smaller scale drones, but they are still lethal, and they've been using this. I actually saw in the CNN video how there were these different command structures within these basements, and they were just coordinating the drone strikes from these destroyed apartment buildings in the Bakhmut city center. So you can see how places like Toretsk, they're actually on a bit of a higher elevation in the east, while in a lower elevation on the west. So it is going to be an uphill battle to advance on Toretsk head on, which is why I don't see that happening. You could see advances along these ridges that are of a lower elevation, but first, of course, Chasiv Yar, the flanks over here would need to be eliminated. And then from there, because of how important this entire area is to Ukraine's cohesiveness of the Donbass front, then you'd 100% have to see them withdraw from Seversk at some point, because really there is a sort of reciprocal relationship between Bakhmut and Seversk, where you're able to communicate with groups in both cities. Units are able to transfer forces from one place to another and supplies, and that couldn't work obviously if Bakhmut falls and the Russians have a flank from the south to attack Seversk. And so that's just like looking at the bigger picture. And thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later.